Welcome to Mid-Century Living, your weekly nostalgia podcast about the best of technology and culture from the mid-20th century.
Welcome back to Mid-Century Living, the show where we talk all about the best of the mid-20th century and how to add vintage vibes to your modern life. We're your hosts, Jackie.
And Gonzalo, thank you for joining us today. Today we have a special episode lined up for you guys, our first interview. We had the chance to talk to Tom Betti, the host of the Pan Am podcast.
We sure did. We had a lot of fun chatting with Tom about the history of Pan Am and the Pan Am Museum. So let's get to the interview.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Mid-Century Living. Today we are joined by Mr. Tom Betti. Tom is the host of the Pan Am podcast, which, through the Pan Am Museum Foundation, is cataloging the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. Tom's show brings the history of Pan Am alive through storytelling and interviews of various people connected with the airline. So, Tom, welcome to our show. We're so glad to have you guys join us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your show, and I love your show. It's a great podcast. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. So I guess to get started, we should probably start at the beginning. So maybe we should ask you with what your Pan Am origin story is. What sparked the interest in Pan Am for you?
Well, it kind of goes back to when I was a kid. I remember going to the 1985 air show in Cleveland. My dad took me. I was 5 years old at the time. And I looked up and I saw this beautiful plane, and it was the Concorde. The Concorde was visiting Cleveland. I grew up outside of Cleveland. And my uncle was a pilot. So I always had aviation and planes, while I was growing up. But my Pan Am story kind of starts with Indiana Jones and James Bond, which both those characters in the movies flew on Pan Am.
Okay.
And when I was 11 in 1991, I was fortunate enough to fly on a Pan Am 747 jumbo jet from New York John F. Kennedy Worldport to Rome. And that's kind of where it started. I was lucky enough to be on the upper deck coming back from Italy to New York. And I was in Clipper class, and I was treated like a prince. And that's when my love affair with Pan Am began. I actually have an interview when we hit our 40th episode of the Pan Am podcast. My colleague, Philip Keene, decided to flip the tables and interview me and tell my story. So there's a little bit more about that 1991 trip involving secret agents and James Bond and everything else, which is kind of interesting. But I won't bore you with that story on this program.
So I actually have listened to that episode, and I think it's a really good one. So if people want to hear more about you, I think maybe we'll link that one in the show notes as well. The secret agent story is particularly interesting. But you did also mention in that interview that you personally own a lot of Pan Am artifacts and artwork. Do you want to tell us a bit about some of your favorite pieces that you've collected?
Sure. I think in my collection, my two favorite pieces is a piece of a window from the last 707 Pan Am jet that's hanging above my bed. And then my other kind of piece of Pan Am memorabilia is the actual Clipper class seats from 747 that I have. I also have a pair of TWA Ambassador class seats. Unfortunately, I live in a small condo in downtown Columbus, and I don't have any room for them, so they're sitting in storage until I get a bigger place. And I am on the lookout for some first class seats from Pan Am in the 1980s or early 90s to complete my collection. So that's what I'm kind of always scouring eBay and Craigslist and everything else, trying to find some Pan Am first class seats, which are leather with sheepskin in the middle. They're beautiful seats, but they have eluded me over the last 20 years of collecting Pan Am stuff.
Did you go after the Clipper class seats specifically because of your experience as a kid, or was that just a happy eBay find?
I would say probably a little bit of both. Because those, yeah, you're right. Those were the seats that I actually sat in when I was 11 on the upper deck of a 747. I saw those on eBay, and I snatched them up. It was kind of one of those finds that was rather difficult because the guy had to sell it within a certain amount of time, and I had to find somebody in New Orleans to, get them.
I'm a little jealous that you got to fly in a 747. That's always been a dream of mine.
Well, you can still fly on passenger 747s. Lufthansa still has them, and also Korea Air still has them. And you can also charter 747s with Atlas Air, but they are, their time of serving passengers, is limited because they're not making any new ones. They are making the new presidential plane for the United States Air Force, the new Air Force One, which is going to be a 747. So you can always fly on Air Force One too. But the last one that I flew on was probably about 10 years ago. It was Virgin Atlantic, but most of the carriers have decommissioned all of their 747.
Cool. So I love the idea that you have part of a plane in your house.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
So,
and I have some cufflinks that were made from the same plane. And I love mid-century modern furniture. So I have a womb chair by Eero Saarinen. And Eero Saarinen has a connection to aviation history because he designed the TWA terminal, which is now the TWA Hotel. So the womb chair has some connection to aviation history through TWA. And then I also have a swan chair, and that's made by Ernie Jacobson. And he designed the SAS Hotel in Copenhagen, Denmark. And SAS is a Danish airline. And he also designed furniture. So you have two very prominent architects and furniture designers from the 1950s and early 1960s that really has made an impact on mid-century modern furniture, but also has a connection to aviation.
That is cool.
Yeah, I'm sad. I'm glad that they thought to do that with the TWA terminal. I'm sad they didn't manage to get anyone to do something like that with the Pan Am one.
Yeah.
Yes, the Pan Am Worldport. Yeah, unfortunately, that was demolished. And for your listeners, so the TWA terminal, when it was designed by Eero Saarinen, kind of looks like this eagle from the outside. It's very organic. He called it the cathedral to aviation. The Pan Am Worldport is a little different design. It had this circular design. It almost looked like a UFO. So it was a completely different design, but that was really cool too. So when I was a kid, I remember we had to fly there in the morning, and our flight to Italy did not leave until the evening, and I just was bored out of my mind. So I explored everything at the Worldport, and I walked out the front doors of the Worldport, which is very iconic, and it's been in a whole bunch of movies. And at that time, I didn't realize it until I turned around and I recognized it from the James Bond movie Live and Let Die, where Roger Moore walks out of the Worldport. Not quite your time frame. That movie came out in 1973. Obviously, I wasn't around then, but I'm a big James Bond fan, so I've seen all of them hundreds of times. And that's kind of when it hit me that, wait a second, I'm flying on Pan American. And, that's when it hit me of the significance of Pan Am at that moment at the Worldport, which is kind of cool. But yeah, it had a very interesting design. And yeah, unfortunately, it was demolished.
I was reading a little bit about that, and people were trying to save it, and apparently the New York Historical Society rejected its historical status because it had already been modified too much by the time they demolished it. So I don't really know what they added and removed.
Yeah, I don't want to speak poorly of anyone, but I think there was lots of politics involved as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's owned by the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, and yeah, I was very disappointed that it did not get protected status. It was on the National Register of Historic Places, I believe. But one of the things that people need to keep in mind that just because something is listed on the National Register of Historic Places does not mean that it's protected.
Mm-hmm.
It can go on the register, and then the next day it can be torn down. So that's something to be considered. But yeah, that was certainly a loss. Fortunately, the Dinner Key Terminal, Pan Am Terminal for the flying boats in Miami, is still there, and it's the Miami City Hall, which you can walk in, and it's very Art Deco. And then also the Marine Air Terminal that was built for Pan Am at LaGuardia is still there. It's now Spirit flies out of there. But that's where the flying boats used to come in New York in the 30s and 40s.
That's cool. So I guess speaking about New York and your collection of artifacts, is that related to how you got started working with the museum, or is there?
So over the years, a lot of my friends would say, "What's up with this Pan Am stuff? Why do you have all this Pan Am stuff? I mean, it's cool, but what's the story?" I would tell them the story, which is a rather long story. And then they said, "Oh, well, you need to publish this story." And finally, somebody during the pandemic, said that. And I'm like, well, I have nothing else to do. I'll go ahead and post this story on Facebook. And, it went viral. And I had Pan Am people from all over the world sending me messages. And then when the Pan Am Museum folks saw it, they reached out to me, and then they realized that I was a historian and I've written history books and done a lot of history stuff. Not my primary job. My primary job, I work in government, pays the bills, but I'm able to do my passion project, which I think everyone should have a passion project.
Mm-hmm.
And that's history for me. And they realized that I was a historian, and they said, we would love for you to join us. And that's kind of how I got started. And when I joined them, I said, I was talking about oral histories and how important oral histories are, especially with the Pan Am community, because the Pan Am community is getting older. The airline has not flown for over 30 years. So the oldest person that worked for Pan Am right now would be in their late 50s,
Mm-hmm.
maybe mid 50s if they were really young when they were hired in 1989. So oral histories are very important to capture these stories before they're no longer with us. These Pan Amers are no longer with us. So I was very focused on oral histories when I joined, and I came up with this idea. I said, why don't we do some kind of radio show? Now, I wasn't envisioning hosting it, but they said, that sounds like a great idea, a podcast. And I said, well, let me put together, a couple episodes. And they loved it. And they said, well, we want you to do this and be the host. So the first, it took 4 episodes for me to actually tell the listeners my name, because I just wanted to be this faceless voice, doing the Pan Am history. But then everybody started sending us messages. Who is this person, doing the podcast? And I don't want to say that, I've become some kind of Pan Am celebrity, but the podcast is very popular, which I'm very grateful for. And I'm kind of the face of what we're doing, which is fine. But I look at myself as a storyteller, and I'm trying to tell the story of this great airline with this 64-year legacy, and how it impacted commercial aviation and changed it forever. And there's always a Pan Am connection to just about everything that happened from 1927 and 1991. And for your listeners, 1950s, 1960s, that's the beginning of the jet age, which totally changed everything. So Pan Am as well as Saarinen and Jacobson as architects and furniture designers, Pan Am is pivotal in this time period. And I'm sure everybody has watched the TV show Mad Men, but you always saw those characters often, wanting to have the Pan Am account, which the Pan Am account in advertising circles was the most coveted account. And once an advertising agency scored Pan Am, I think IBM and maybe Coca-Cola would be second and third. You've made it, because that's the most coveted account in that time period. And you kind of see that with the Mad Men TV series, because they kind of mention Pan Am from time to time.
They sure do.
Jackie's a big fan of Mad Men.
Big
How
fan.
many times have you rewatched it? 17 times?
I think 6, but I lost count.
Oh,
I'm kind of perpetually rewatching it. It's just one of those shows. Once I'm done, I just start it up again,
and
I just take breaks for several months, and then I just pick up right where I left off.
Oh, it's a great show. And what's great about Mad Men and the movie Catch Me If You Can, which came out in 2002, is they kind of introduced this era, but also introduced Pan Am to a whole new generation of people. So I credit Catch Me If You Can, and I also credit Mad Men and the Pan Am TV show that came out, a decade ago or so, by introducing, our incredible history to a whole new generation.
Yeah, definitely.
The Pan Am TV show has been on my list for a while, but I don't have AMC Plus.
It's good. Yeah, it's not bad.
It got canceled after one season, but it looked beautiful.
Yeah, I mean it's beautifully shot. The crazy thing about the show is that they didn't really use real stories. They kind of invented some fictional stories. And with my work, with the podcast, is they didn't have to make up anything. There was lots of different, you name it, there spy stories, romance stories, celebrity stories. So the writers could have looked at all of these real stories and maybe they based the show off real stories, but I felt like it could have been a little bit more compelling. But the problem is it was on ABC, and a lot of these network shows, you have network executives that interfere with stuff. There's been a lot of shows that I really loved that the networks, either pulled the plug, didn't see the potential of it, or really interfered with it. I think the most famous one would be Star Trek, 1966 to 1968. 3 seasons, and the network pulled the plug on that because people didn't understand, or they thought that people didn't understand it. And obviously we know what happened with Star Trek, and how it came back and became part of our cultural story.
And they're still making new series to this day.
Yeah.
Like, they really had no idea what they were doing when they pulled the plug on that.
But you gotta wonder if they hadn't pulled the plug, would it be as big as it is now?
I don't know. But I look back at these storytellers of this time period. Preparing for this show, I was trying to think on what I was going to say, and sometimes I don't know what I'm going to say until I start talking, but which gets me into trouble sometimes. But I was thinking about this time period, 1950s, 1960s, and all of the great storytellers of this time period. So when I say storytellers, I'm talking about Tolkien, I'm talking about Ian Fleming, Alfred Hitchcock, Gene Roddenberry. And with Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek, there's a Pan Am connection, because there's a Pan Am connection to everything. And I'm actually working on an episode right now all about Gene Roddenberry. And your listeners are probably wondering, well, why the hell is he doing that? So Gene Roddenberry, growing up in the 1930s with the China Clipper and the rise of Pan Am and commercial aviation, he always wanted to be an airline pilot. And then World War II happened, and he joined the Army Air Corps. and flew for them. He did become a pilot. And then after the war, he got hired at Pan American World Airways, and he was a pilot for Pan Am. And he was a pilot for a few years. He was kind of not really liking it, but he's working for Pan Am. He's getting to fly around the world. And unfortunately, there was this terrible crash in the desert. He was on a Constellation aircraft. He was not flying it. He was the fourth officer. He was deadheading at the time. And for your listeners, deadheading means that you're a airline employee as a passenger trying to get to another destination so that you can get on your plane so you can fly it. So that's what deadheading means. And they lost 2 engines, and the plane crashed in the desert, and he was able to rescue passengers. Unfortunately, his friends in the cockpit all perished. The first officer was named McCoy, and he decided that he didn't want to fly anymore, and he was going to move to LA, and he was going to write for this new medium of television. And that's kind of why he stopped flying for Pan Am. I think there was some PTSD involved as well. It's pretty traumatic being in a plane crash and seeing your friends die and passengers. And he led these passengers for 24 hours until they were rescued. And in that period, and I found this rare interview where he talks about the crash and he talks about flying for Pan Am, which I believe is the only time he ever talked about it. This was like this unspoken thing. And he said, he kind of looked at his life and he had this new kind of Zen view of the world. And he decided he didn't want to fly anymore. And he moved to LA, started writing police shows, joined the LAPD so that he can get some stories from some folks. And then he eventually wrote Star Trek. And if you ever watch Star Trek, there is a Dr. McCoy. I don't know if he was named after his friend that died in that plane crash, but it's certainly a likely coincidence.
I did notice that when you were retelling the story, you said McCoy, and a light bulb went off.
Yeah. And I don't think that this interview, which I'm going to publish on our YouTube channel once we publish the podcast, and I'm trying to get someone that knew Gene Roddenberry to be interviewed. So I have some interesting celebrities that will be a great addition to the Pan Am podcast if I can get them to agree to speak about Gene Roddenberry. But I don't believe that he ever spoke about it. And I don't think he ever spoke about how he named the characters. But again, there's a Pan Am connection that I can find. I'll tell the story. But those storytellers that I mentioned, Hitchcock and Ian Fleming for one, they really defined their movies, defined this era that your podcast is about. The James Bond films and the Hitchcock films were, and then obviously everything that happened in television that Gene Roddenberry did. And then what they were able to do is inspire future storytellers like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of storytellers. Star Trek is on my list. It's a little intimidating to start researching that. Maybe hyper focusing on the original series, I think, is probably the answer, and it makes sense for our podcast as well.
And there's a book that someone got me, and it's all about mid-century modern furniture in Star Trek, which is really interesting. And in Ticonderoga, New York, there's a gentleman there that worked on Star Trek The Next Generation in the early 90s. And one of his mentors gave him the blueprints to the Desilu studio of the original series, the 1966 show. And he meticulously recreated the Desilu studios of Star Trek, and you're able to visit it. Now, Ticonderoga, New York is upstate New York. You would have to fly into, I believe, Burlington, Vermont, and then drive over. So it's kind of out of the way. But for your podcast, the mid-century modern furniture is certainly right up your alley.
Yes.
Yes, we've talked about a couple of pieces and how much we want an Eames chair.
So, Storytellers is a great transition into talking a little bit more about the Pan Am podcast. So, you've had the chance to interview several key figures from Pan Am, from pilots to flight attendants and more. So, how do you choose your guests?
Well, good question. I feel like we're running against the clock. Unfortunately, since I started this podcast in August of 2021, I've already lost 5 of my guests. They've passed away. So I feel like time, I'm running against the clock, the hourglass.
Oh, no.
And so I try to prioritize stories and people that lived those stories based on their age. And I also like to tell the story not only of pilots, but flight attendants and maintenance people and passengers and authors and historians that maybe never flew on Pan Am, but they have something to contribute. So it's difficult for me to answer how I choose the guests. For instance, I have a request into a certain Star Trek actor who happens to be a pilot. So if that person agrees to come on the podcast, then we would certainly talk about Gene Roddenberry and we would talk about Star Trek, but we would also talk about flying and planes and that kind of thing, because this person knows all about it because he flies. So Pan Am can be a part of the story, but it doesn't have to be everything. For instance, I interviewed Sam Donaldson of ABC News. He was chief White House correspondent for President Carter, Reagan, and part of President Clinton's administrations. And we talked about Pan Am because Pan Am always did the White House press charters. And what I mean by that is the White House press office would take care of travel for journalists. So journalists would have an opportunity to fly on Air Force One with the president as a passenger, but the people that did not win that press pool would then fly on a other plane that would fly with Air Force One. And that was usually Pan Am. Every once in a while, TWA would get the White House press charters, but usually it was Pan Am. Pan Am was like the number one. So for instance, when John F. Kennedy flew to Dallas, there was a Pan Am plane that flew with him. And when Nixon went to China, there was a Pan Am plane with journalists that flew with him. And what would happen, and again, everything's theatrical. Now it's a little bit different because you have photojournalists and videographers all over the place. But back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the journalists would go to Andrews Air Force Base. All the journalists would go there. The journalists that won the pool would fly with the president on Air Force One, and everybody else would fly on the White House press charter plane, which is usually a Pan Am plane. And the president would arrive usually on Marine One, which is the president's helicopter. He would walk to Air Force One. As soon as his foot hit the deck of the plane, they would spool up the engines. The president would then be seated, and the Air Force One would take off. They wouldn't wait for anybody. And what would happen is all the journalists were outside taking pictures of Air Force One taking off. Okay. And then after Air Force One took off, then all those journalists would get on the Pan Am plane, and the Pan Am plane would take off. Now, there was something that happened mid-flight. Air Force One, which got priority for everything, would call the Pan Am plane and ask where their location was. And the Pan Am plane would say, we're here or wherever. And Air Force One would say, we're initiating a slowdown, and the Pan Am plane then would overtake Air Force One. You know why?
So they could be there whenever the Air Force One landed.
Exactly. So the Pan Am plane lands first.
Mm-hmm.
All the journalist gets out, takes pictures of Air Force One landing and the president coming off the plane.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this highly orchestrated mission that was highly orchestrated. So getting back to my Sam Donaldson interview, we would talk about him flying on Pan Am, and they called it the party plane. And all of the journalists wanted to fly on the press charter because all the Pan Am crew knew them well. They knew what drinks they wanted. It was usually better food and everything else. And they can kind of let their hair down and kind of, relax. When you're on Air Force One, it's a little bit more formal and you really can't, have a party. But
Right.
on the Pan Am plane, you can. So in the interview, we talked about that, but then I started talking about, I asked him about, his career, and he told me all about his career. So I kind of look at the podcast as this storytelling tool that as long as I have a little bit of Pan Am, but it doesn't have to be everything. I have this interesting guest and we're going to talk about it. For instance, he told me about his favorite interview, and that was a gentleman that was an SS officer in the Nazi military during World War II, and how this ABC News crew found him in Argentina, and then Sam Donaldson flew there, and he basically admitted everything on camera to Sam Donaldson, and everyone thought he was dead. The Italians thought he was dead. He was part of this terrible massacre in Rome towards the end of World War II. And all of a sudden, ABC News broke this story, and we talked a lot about that, which had nothing to do with Pan Am because that happened in 1994, and Pan Am went out of business in 1991. But
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't we explore other things? Pan Am the episode had to do with the White House press charters, but why wouldn't we talk about his career? So I kind of used the podcast as a storytelling tool. And, we look at 20th century history through the prism of this American international airline. And as long as I can find some morsel of Pan Am connection, I go for it. But then, we can talk about other things too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what the listener wants. The listener, there's this Pan Am story, but there's also this other equally interesting stories to tell.
Yeah. Pan Am is so like intertwined with not just aviation history, but like all kinds of history.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to this day, I keep uncovering things, and other people keep uncovering things that, it's amazing. For instance, Pan Am's role in World War II and commercial aviation really, without the advent of commercial aviation in the 1930s and all of the aviation technology, the Allies would not have been prepared at all for World War II. So really, in my experience, in my opinion, I think that commercial aviation is the missing link when people talk about the interwar period between
Mm-hmm.
World War I and World War II. And as a historian, I think that period is so crucial, and it's so underrepresented in the history of World War II that I really encourage fellow historians, authors, and the public to kind of look at that period and look at what was happening in commercial aviation. And with the China Clipper and Pan Am crossing the Pacific Ocean, that was like the moonshot of the day. There were people in the 1930s that said this was the story of the century.
Mm-hmm.
There were 100,000 people that showed up in San Francisco to see the China Clipper take off. It was a huge, huge event. The reason why I'm connecting this to the overall interwar period before World War II is the Japanese viewed Pan Am's expansion in the Pacific as aggressive, and they viewed Pan Am as an extension of the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not entirely incorrect. They were not entirely wrong, because Juan Trippe and Pan Am were working very closely with the U.S. Navy and the Roosevelt administration, and they were already preparing for war at that time. Is more of a defensive measure. But in order to cross the Pacific Ocean in the 1930s, the biggest obstacle was getting from San Francisco to Honolulu, because there is nothing in between. There's
Mm-hmm.
if you are flying to Honolulu and you have a engine problem and you're beyond the point of safe return, you just keep on going and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 50s, there was an incident where there was a Stratocruiser that ditched in the Pacific Ocean. That's a good example of that. Fortunately, everyone was saved, but it was the first miracle on the Pacific where a plane landed on water, and fortunately, everybody was rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard. But getting back to the 1930s, so if you can build a plane that can have the range from San Francisco to Honolulu, then once you get to Hawaii, then you can find other islands west of Hawaii, and you can build bases. And this is what Juan Trippe did with Pan Am. He built bases on Wake Island and Midway Island and Guam. Now, Wake and Midway, there wasn't much there at all. So he had to go through the U.S. government, and the government gave him permission to build these bases, but they were highly involved with it. And they said, you know what, instead of building, this here, why don't you build it over here, because it's a little bit deeper over here. And we can easily convert that into a submarine base, for instance. So the U.S. military was highly involved. And then in addition to that, you had pilots during the late 1930s, Pan Am pilots, that were spying on Japanese naval movements and reporting it back to the U.S. Navy. And they also had secret orders that if war would break out, these are highly advanced aircraft. This is like the Concorde or some cutting edge things in the high-tech engines and everything else. They had secret orders that if war broke out, under no circumstances should you let your aircraft be captured by the enemy. Either crash it, scuttle it, or escape. Because if the enemy got a hold of these brand new Pratt & Whitney engines of the B-314 flying boat, that would be a national security problem.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to what I was saying, I don't think the Japanese were entirely wrong when they said that, Pan Am was an extension of the U.S. government during the 1930s. So that period, that interwar period of the 1930s aviation and Pan Am is highly underrated in the history of World War II.
Yeah. Well, and Pan Am played such a big part in history also in the mid-century after the war.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What would you say might be your most favorite or your most important part of that time period?
Well, so after the war, there was runways all over the place. That, in some cases, Pan Am helped the U.S. government and the British government build airports and runways. So you had this conversion. The flying boats were now obsolete. So now you had land planes. So Boeing looked at a lot of the designs of their bombers and sometimes modified those designs for passenger aircraft. And one of the passenger aircrafts that came out was the Boeing Stratocruiser. And this was a double-decker luxurious plane. It was huge, very large at the time. And that kind of defined the 1950s luxury travel. It was a propeller plane. The lounge was actually on the bottom of the plane. I interviewed a flight attendant that flew on one of them. She has since passed away, but she was telling me that one of her passengers there was a group of them, and they were in the lounge, and they were just very depressed. And she couldn't figure out why they were depressed. Can I bring you some food? Can I bring you some drinks? Whatever you want, just let me know what you need. And the lead person in the group said, all we want to do is play our instruments. We love music. And she said, well, I could do that because the lounge was on the bottom of the plane and you can access the cargo hold. So she said, tell me what your instruments look like and I can go get them. And she went and she got them and brought them back, which she probably broke some rules, but it's been, I think, long enough that she wouldn't get in trouble. And they started playing. And then people from the upper deck, this was about 1953, 54. The people on the upper deck, started hearing this music. So they start coming down. And the gentleman that was playing was Louis Armstrong. And he was doing a concert in the sky. And finally, the pilot calls down and speaks to the flight attendant and said, what's going on down there? Like the plane is the weight balance is all off. And I've been trying to keep the plane level because all the people were in the front, which was breaking all the rules because there was a limit of how many people you can be. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, Mr. Armstrong is playing some music for our passengers and they're really loving it. And the pilot's like, oh, well, I guess we can make an exception for this flight. But those kind of stories are, it's amazing. She's talking about Louis Armstrong, this legend of music. So I would say the Stratocruiser definitely defined the late 1940s, 1950s period up until 1958 and defined that era of luxury travel. Mm-hmm. And then comes 1958, the Boeing 707, and really the beginning of the jet age, the official beginning of the jet age. Now, when we talk about the Boeing 707 and the jet age, a lot of people overlook what happened a few years earlier. And that was maybe a false start of the jet age. And that is the British Comet. Mm-hmm. The design still is one of my favorite designs in aircraft. Pan Am ordered a few of them, and the British built the first passenger jet aircraft. And everyone thought that the British was going to dominate commercial aviation with this design. And for a couple years, they did. They had the first jet pressurized aircraft. The Queen and the Queen Mum traveled on it, and it was the pride of Britain until they started blowing up. And they couldn't figure out why, so they grounded the whole fleet. A lot of the companies canceled their orders, including Pan Am. And they figured out that one of the reasons why they were exploding mid-flight was the design of the windows. And they had these square windows. And on that right angle, instead of screwing in the bolts, they punched them, mm-hmm. right? And mm-hmm. every time an aircraft pressurizes and depressurizes, the aluminum expands and contracts. And if the aircraft is not designed properly, then over time you're going to have microfractures that are going to end up being major fractures, and then you're going to have an explosive decompression. Mm-hmm. So that was the problem. Boeing sat back and they learned all the mistakes the British made with the Comet. And they corrected all of those mistakes. They learned from all of those mistakes. And by the time they re-engineered the Comet, the Boeing 707 was on its way. And Pan Am and an American company, Boeing, dominated the whole commercial aviation industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the official start of the jet age began with Pan Am in 1958. And then you had the Beatles, fly on Pan Am, several years later. And that Boeing 707 really defined the 1960s up until the introduction of the Boeing 747, which Pan Am was heavily involved with.
Mm-hmm.
And that then you entered into the jumbo jet era and the economic travel and really shrinking the globe and everything else. So in commercial aviation history, the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s was pivotal because you had these three great airplanes that really defined luxury travel, and that this is all in the mid-century modern period. You had the Stratocruiser, late 1940s up until 1958, where you had the Boeing 707, and then you had the Boeing 747 in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a little asterisk, and that's the Comet with BOAC, which is the predecessor of British Airways, which was very
Mm-hmm.
luxurious. And if it wasn't for those problems, the British would have certainly dominated commercial aviation as we know it, but it didn't. It wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
Unrelated, but just curious question. Well, unrelated to Pan Am, but related to what you just talked about. So when they reconfigured the Comet, it was kind of too late because of the Boeing 707 you said was already out, but was the new version of the Comet really popular in Britain or?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. British aerospace is interesting because it wasn't as successful as American aerospace, but eventually, they created the Concorde, and everyone talks about the European Union. And several years ago, the United Kingdom left the European Union, but the reason why the United Kingdom entered the European Union in the beginning was because now that the Boeing 707 was out and the jet age began, all of the Western nations, United States, United Kingdom, France, and Canada, and the Soviet Union, were all focused on what comes next. And everybody was focused on supersonic travel.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans were focused on it. They had some missteps. Lockheed was working on a passenger supersonic plane. Boeing was working on one. The Canadians were working on one, and the British and the French were both working on one. And obviously the Soviet Union was working on one and also stealing secrets from everybody else, but that's another story. But what really the turning point of that was 1962, and Britain and France said, why don't we combine our resources and work on this together? And Britain's price to pay was becoming a member of the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
And they both had this treaty and this contract that really locked them into this project. And it was extremely expensive. And that's how the Concorde was born. And the Concorde, the Americans and Boeing and everybody else, it's a long story, but it never materialized, and it was eventually canceled. And the operation of the Concorde was super expensive. So the only people that could afford to fly those were the national carriers of United Kingdom and France.
Mm-hmm.
That being Air France and BOAC, which then would become British Airways. So that the Concorde has a really important role in the mid-century modern period too, because that was the rage in the 1960s. Everybody went, John F. Kennedy's inauguration speech when he was talking about landing a man on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
He was also talking about supersonic travel. He didn't come out and say it, but he was. And everybody was on this race for the supersonic travel. So back to the comet, British aerospace would then evolve with French aerospace, and now we have this huge company called Airbus.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the origins of where that came from.
I was just curious while you were talking. I don't. Yeah. It just got me interested because you said I figured we actually covered the comet in our jet engines episode.
It's cool. Yeah.
Where we kind of did like the greatest hits in 30 minutes. And I didn't, I thought once the comet was such a disaster that they just kind of scrapped it and moved on. I didn't realize until you mentioned then that they actually tried to fix it. But everyone else had moved on to Boeing at that point.
And really the American carriers were leading the way. But things would change later because if you have, we didn't have a national carrier in the United States. We still don't have a national carrier in the United States. And when I say national carrier, what I mean is you have an airline that's backed by your government. Pan Am was never backed by the U.S. government. It was the de facto national carrier because of regulations. There was only a couple airlines that could fly international, TWA and Pan Am, up until deregulation. So Pan Am was the de facto national carrier for the United States, but it wasn't the official carrier. When you're the official carrier of a country, then you're backed by their government, which means that if you go into financial problems, then your government can help you and underwrite costs and that kind of thing. So unfortunately, that's part of the reason why Pan Am's no longer in business is because of deregulation and the government not getting involved or intervening and preventing it from expanding. Pan Am was kind of the too big to fail, and everyone was worried about monopolies. Pan Am would just go in and take everything. So the government stunted its growth heavily in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. And then you got terrorism, and then you got mismanagement, and they overly invested in the 747, which meant that they had a whole bunch of debt. And I mean, everything just came to a head after Lockerbie in 1988, and then it stuck around for a few more years, and then it went out of business.
I read though that the Flight Academy is still around.
Yeah, so the Pan Am Flight Academy is still around, and the brand is owned by a company. So if you want to put the Pan Am logo on a product or have it in a movie, you have to, pay licensing fees to a company called Pan Am Brands. They're also doing a Pan Am inspired trip across the Atlantic. If you got an extra $60,000 laying around, you can be a passenger. Unfortunately, I do not, and I will not be on this plane, but they are going to paint the outside of the plane in Pan Am livery, which would be nice. Really cool.
That would be cool.
And depending on how successful that is, they're going to have more, which is kind of cool. So it's like this, it's not bringing the airline back, but kind of reimagining the airline in a modern way, and having it more of an experience than an airline for people that could afford it. So that's exciting. And there are other opportunities that are presenting itself for that for-profit company that owns the brand. The Pan Am Museum, we are a nonprofit, so we're focused on the history of the airline from 1927 and 1991. But we certainly want the brand and the legacy to endure. So we are very supportive of these new ventures.
And that is perfect because we love to end all of our episodes with a connection to today, and you did that for us. So what a smooth transition.
Yeah. Yeah. The podcasts, I'm still amazed by, we have 150,000 downloads as of today. And I'm still amazed that people find this topic interesting. And I feel a huge responsibility and stewardship of this history. And there are two types of history people. There's the collectors. Those are the people that go out and do a lot of research and find a lot of artifacts and rare things, but they kind of keep it for themselves, and they're archivists. Nothing against, I'm not saying anything negative about it, but it's just a different approach. And then if you are a researcher or a student, then you contact them and kind of have to prove that you're serious about it, and then they'll give you access to certain things. And then the other kind, and this is more my philosophy, is the educator. And that means that, I want everyone to have access to this really interesting stories and history. One of the things that I've done with our YouTube channel is we have a vast collection of commercials, Pan Am commercials from all different eras, and also training videos and corporate videos, news clips, so that if a student or somebody just casually interested in Pan Am can go to our YouTube channel and pretty much find just about everything that they're looking for, or they didn't think they were looking for, but now they're looking for it. So we have to date 3.5 million views on our YouTube channel, which is just astounding. So every once in a while I get somebody that says, why are you doing this? Why would anyone be interested in an airline that hasn't been in business for over 30 years? And I applied for a grant once, and one of the assessors, basically, said, why should we fund this? And over time, we've kind of proven that this is an interesting tool. And if we can get people interested in history, aviation history, Pan Am history, Mad Men, what you guys are doing, people, look at your clothing and furniture and have a newfound appreciation for it. That's what we're trying to do here. I view our podcast as a humanities podcast because we're telling the stories of people. And, what you guys are doing, with this era, mid-century modern, and talking about what it's like to live. I mean, some of the recipes in the 1950s and 60s with Jell-O and stuff, like, oh my God, who would eat that?
There's a process. I've read a lot of vintage cookbooks, and you start reading your first one and you think everything sounds disgusting. And then about 12 cookbooks in, you're like, I like chicken salad. Why not encase it in Jell-O? I don't see how that would be that weird. Like, I like all these ingredients.
But then there's a connection. I remember, my grandparents kind of cooking stuff like that, and, the furniture in their house. And we're all connected in some way. So yeah, the Mad Men thing, sometimes we think about our grandparents and great grandparents, what they were doing at that time, how were they living. So that's why I'm so passionate about history, because we're all connected. And if we can connect people to appreciate what came before us, and, encourage them to, if you like it, mid-century modern furniture is fantastic. Knoll furniture. I have a womb chair, and everybody's like, "Oh, that looks so great." And be yourself. You're connected. Go and get some vintage clothing, and have your own style. My style is kind of unique. It's kind of Art Deco, 1920s and 30s / mid-century modern.
And that's the great thing about looking backwards. You're able to now, well, back in the 60s, all of their furniture was in the 60s, or it was older than that. But now you can pick your favorite Art Deco pieces, and you can blend them with your favorite mid-century modern pieces, and that's the beauty of appreciating that now while
And-
having all of the options we have today.
And one
So-
thing, like looking at all of the Pan Am travel posters is really cool because they also represent those eras. You have the 1930s posters, and then you have the 1950s and 60s posters. And then the 70s, I don't know what people were on in the 70s, but some of the 70s architecture, that brutalism architecture, and the 70s fashion and style, sometimes I really wonder what they were smoking. But for me, you can look through all these travel posters, and each one of them tells you something about that particular era. It's like a time capsule. Same thing with uniforms and aircraft interiors. I mean, the aircraft interiors of the 1970s were wild.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 1980s were more muted with grays and dark blues. So it's interesting. The Stratocruiser, the interior of the Stratocruiser, 1950s, tells a story. Everything tells a story. And everybody has a story.
We agree.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to hear someone else who's like us can just ramble on about. I feel like every episode we've done could have been 4 episodes. We were just trying to write it in. There's just so much to cover.
Yeah.
And it's nice to hear more people passionate about this time period and about sharing history just for the sake of sharing history. So
Yeah, definitely.
we've really enjoyed talking.
And you know what I like about your podcast is I can hear the passion in your voices.
Yeah.
And that's something. Like that passion, cultivate that passion and share it in what you guys are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And, for your listeners, if you have a passion, whatever it is, go for it. The great thing about the internet is everybody's connected. In whatever passion, you can find other people that are equally passionate about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. So you mentioned your YouTube channel and obviously the podcast. So if people who want to learn more about Pan Am or share their passion, how can they reach you? Where can they find you?
Sure. So our podcast is on wherever you listen to your podcast, you can find it. Just search the Pan Am Podcast. When I was putting the podcast together, there was a whole bunch of people that had a whole bunch of names, and I said, let's just keep it simple, like the Pan Am Podcast. That makes sense. So just search for that, and then on YouTube, just search Pan Am Museum, and you'll find our channel there. And then our website is panam.info. It's the same website address, or it's the same website as our other website address is thepanammuseum.org.
Mm-hmm.
But the redirect is simpler. So I've been kind of telling people that, and that's just panam.info.
Awesome.
Do you have any other personal projects you want to plug while you're here?
Well, like I said, I'm a big proponent of passion projects. And I'm very lucky because I have 3 of them. The first one is Columbus history. So I do a lot of tours. I've co-written 5 books on Columbus history with my history partner and mentor, Doreen Uhas Sauer. And I've been doing that for almost 2 decades now, working with her on different things, talking about architecture, the history of neighborhoods, that kind of thing. The second one is the Pan Am Project, the podcast and all of the stuff that we do at the Pan Am Museum. And then my third passion project, this may surprise folks, but I dress up in Star Wars for charities, children's hospitals, that kind of thing.
Oh, cool.
And I feel like a kid. So I have a stormtrooper, a TIE pilot, an officer, and a couple others that I'm working on. And The organization that I'm a part of is called the 501st Legion, and we are a nonprofit organization. We're affiliated with Lucasfilm, and all of our uniforms and costumes are screen accurate. So in the unlikely event that Lucasfilm would be filming a Star Wars project here in Columbus, Ohio, they could call me and I could be on screen and fit right in. But for me, seeing kids light up and also seeing adults light up and kind of reconnecting with their childhood, and our motto is bad guys doing good, because we're the bad guys of Star Wars. Again, it's so important to have passion projects, something that doesn't have anything to do with your day job, that you can, don't worry about money, just follow your passions.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that might surprise folks. It's not quite mid-century modern, but yeah, Star Wars.
Hey, we covered the first Star Wars in an episode, actually. It was one of our 70s Rule Breaker episodes. Like I said, we try to keep it reined in to just a very specific time period, but the early 70s had some gems in it as well. So, well, thank you again so much for this interview. You are a wealth of knowledge, and this was a joy. Real quick before we go, though, in our first ever episode, Gonzalo and I had talked about like mid-century icons we'd invite to a dinner party if we could. So I thought it would be fun, you as our first guest, to share that with our audience as well. So if you could invite any 3 people from the mid-century to a dinner party today, who would they be and why?
That's a good question. Definitely Alfred Hitchcock. Harry Truman would be my second. I almost said Ian Fleming, but he was kind of a snob, and I don't think I would get along with him, even though I love his books and the character of James Bond. The third one, maybe Grace Kelly, because she's just classy. And Hitchcock would love her sitting there, and Truman would probably love it too. So there you go.
Yes. Awesome. Well, again, thank you for chatting with us today and for being a guest on our podcast.
Well, thank you both, and keep up the great work. I love your podcast, and again, that passion, you can hear it, and keep following your passions.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And that was the interview. I think it went well. What do you think?
I think it went amazingly. It was a lot of fun. Just everything was fun.
Yeah, I agree. I cannot believe he has all of that information in his brain and that he just pull out at any moment.
Yes.
It's no wonder he's written 5 books.
Yes. I don't know if I had I was trying to come up with like a favorite part to be like, this is my favorite part, but I think the whole thing was my favorite part. So I did, however, like the fact that he has bits and pieces of Airplane, like I am so jealous, because I would love to have. Okay, so there's this. I don't know if you ever watched Bones, the TV show, but the FBI agent, sometimes they shoot at his quote house, and anyway, he's got like a part of like a wing on the wall, and it's like an old school plane where like the metal's not there, it's just the wood, and it's like, man, I would love to have a piece of an aircraft, like a propeller. Bonus points if it was like the propeller to 624 Tango Alpha, which is one of the planes I fly out of a little airport.
Yeah, that as far as Pan Am memorabilia, I was not expecting him to say seats.
Yes.
But yeah, I was expecting napkins or swizzle sticks.
I have a duffel bag, and my parents have cutlery that was definitely not taken from first class.
I think my favorite part of the interview were all of the tie-ins to Star Trek and Star Wars, and how he was able to, anytime there was anything close to a tangent, he was able to tie it back to Pan Am. I just think that was really cool.
Yes.
That's the kind of skill I'm hoping to have with Mad Men one day, which I think I'm actually pretty good at.
Yeah, I think you're pretty good at it. You bring it in every so often. But With that, guys, it looks like we have finally landed the jet clipper. Thank you all for listening today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show and tell a friend.
You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube at MCL Podcast. Instagram is actually the best place to send us feedback and episode suggestions, so send us a DM anytime. You can also contact us through our Send Us a Text Message feature in the show notes, and if you do, we'll read it on our next episode.
Yeah, so send us some fan mail. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Bye!
Thank you for listening to Mid-Century Living. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at MCL Podcast. See you next Friday.